Okay. So back in 2000, in the year 2000, so 10 years after the transition to from socialism to capitalism, there was a very interesting survey taken in Poland. Respondents were asked to assess the period of the PRL, the Polska Rzeczpospolita Ludowa, or Polish People's Republic. And what was interesting, very surprising, was that the positive and the negative assessments were virtually tied, almost the same. Now, I remember how stunned and surprised I was when I saw this result. Growing up in the United States during the Cold War, when I thought about the communist bloc, I thought about prisons, I thought about surveillance, I thought about oppression, I thought about censorship. And this is the way that the history of communism was presented to us, not merely in popular culture, but also among academics very much as well, that communism was about oppression. That was the theme that you talked about. Ironically, after the Cold War ended, this approach, I think, got even stronger. Now, to be sure, there have been quite a large number of books that have been criticizing the neoliberal systems that emerged in the 1990s. I don't think any serious observer would doubt that there's a lot to criticize, so that's fair. But behind almost all of these, virtually all of these books, is the assumption that, yes, it's really bad today, and we've done things badly, but it was even worse before. Fair enough, but if that's true in a straightforward way, then how do we explain survey results like this? There's a problem there, there's a question. Now, if we directly ask people to assess whether it was worth it, czy warto było in Polish, if it was worth it to change the system. Well, now in this case, large majorities have consistently said, yes, it was worth it. Although it is interesting to note that the size of the majority has changed over time. And particularly striking, and this begins to get us to some interesting data here, that the most recent that I've been able to find version of this question from 2009 showed a radical, dramatic shrinking of the number of people who said it was not worth it. In other words, nowadays, today, there's an almost unanimous consensus that it was worth it to change the system. And that's a much stronger sentiment than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. One reason for this is that things have gotten much better in Poland, so it's easier to say that it was worth it to make the change. There's also another factor, though, and that is that nowadays, when you ask this question in a survey, most of the people responding have no personal memory of the communist era. They are going off of what they have heard from history textbooks, from the media. And even within these, these particular surveys, you see some very interesting differentiations. So if we dig a little deeper into the survey, so here's the 1999 version. So on the 10th anniversary, when we're still talking about a population that remembered it personally, you can see that among people with a college education, so among people like us, the consensus is overwhelming. There are almost everybody agrees that it was worth it. But as we move to less and less education, the ambivalence begins to grow. I think that's relevant. Framing this question in a different way, as recently as 2004, surveys showed that about 45% of Poles thought that things had actually gotten worse. Now, again, you see that by 2009 already, there's a huge shift that things have gotten better. again, in part because they had gotten better. I think that's objectively true. But it's also true that we're, again, dealing with a population that has less and less personal recollection of the communist era. That age may have something to do with this can be shown if we dig into the data more deeply. So here's the results from that 2014 survey. And what you can see in this is that different age cohorts have very different views of the communist era. Put simply, those who have no memory of communism are most likely to view it negatively. Now, one problem with all of these surveys that is very clear is that you're asking people about very broad abstractions, systemic historical changes, very large words and large concepts. And that means that anybody answering this question is going to be responding based on a mixture of personal memories, if they have them, and then whatever they hear in the media, in church, in schools, from their families, things like that. So one way pollsters have tried to get past that problem is to ask people more specific questions about their personal lives and their personal situations. And this, I think, shows some very interesting results. So if you have to ask people, if you assess your own situation or that of your family, would you count yourself among those who were harmed by the changes or those who benefited from the changes? And here we see something, I think, that is quite startling. Only 14%, and this is again from 10 years after the changes, 14% said that, that they benefited. We should remember that in the late 1990s, as I'll talk about in a moment, there had been already the recovery from the horrible recession of the 80s and 90s was pretty much accomplished. But yet the progress of the last 20 years had not yet really happened. But nonetheless, this was surprising. Only 14% unambiguously said that they benefited. The biggest result, 52%, so a majority, were ambivalent. And this is the key word that I really want to emphasize today: ambivalence, nuance, something that I think has been very sorely lacking in the way we talk about the communist era, but which in personal memories is the dominant sentiment of that phrase, of that phase of history. Just one final survey result. And a question, this was from 2003, asking, when was life easier? That's a very interesting way to frame the question. And here, to, I think, just about anybody's surprise, 50% said life was easier in the PRL, and only 11% said it's easier in 2003. Now, it's entirely possible, in fact, I think it's probable, that many people thought this way. They thought, well, life is harder now, but it also brings greater rewards. I work harder, but I have more material comfort, more consumer goods. And so I'll still assess things positively. But even then, they say life was easier then. So we're beginning to get towards that nuance that I think we should emphasize, an impression that undermines our view that is so common, I think, in popular memory, that there was this era of darkness and oppression and suffering that was then alleviated by the Great Revolution of 1989. Instead, we're beginning to see a more complicated picture of a life that many people thought, a large number of people thought was easier, and that a great number of people saw positive aspects in. So how do we explain this nuance? What results from trying to uncover the complexity and the nuance and the nostalgia that appears in all of this survey data. The disconnect that I'm talking about here is at its foundation a very, very important one, because it relates to the tendency, very common here in the United States, in Poland, in Europe, just about everywhere, of looking at history through the eyes of people like us. Who writes history? The people who write history books are people with higher education, usually, a lot of education. And for people like us, the communist era was pretty unambiguously bad. I lived in Poland in the 1980s. I did not like it. That was a world in which one had to be careful about what one said, a world in which there was censorship, a world in which the media and a lot of entertainment was highly controlled. And for someone who is engaged in public life in any way, even someone who is just interested in politics, these weigh heavily, those concerns weigh heavily. Among those who are not engaged in such concerns, those who are only somewhat interested in politics or not interested at all, those whose concerns are more focused on their own personal lives, that's where we begin to see the nuance. So we have this tendency of viewing the world through narrow lenses. And I think the challenge for historians is to begin to break away from that. Now, fortunately, we are seeing just such a breakage. There have been quite a number of books that have come out over the last 5 to 10 years, and more each year, both in Polish and in other languages, that is beginning to show why various people might have various viewpoints on what it was like to live in the communist era, beginning to chip away at the monolithic image that we used to have. The goal of all this scholarship, and my goal in this talk today, is not to rehabilitate the reputation of communism. It would be silly to replace the negative stereotype with an equally homogeneous positive stereotype. I certainly do not want to do that. Instead, our objective is to escape the Cold War polemics altogether and begin to find that nuance that characterizes personal memories of the communist era. We need to capture the world that's reviewed, that's presented in this survey. This was an open-ended question. So what do you associate with the time of the PRL? Just, you could answer anything. And then they group the answers into various categories. And what you can see is that the most common response was a positive one, full employment, followed immediately by a negative one, shortages, empty shelves. Then there were lines and rationings, but then right away, a better life. And then, of course, something that I think it's easy not to remember, when a lot of people remember the communist era, what they're remembering is when they were young. And most of us have nice memories of, we view fondly when we were young. And so that influences and shapes a lot of these. But however you interpret this, this type of, this set of responses, this mixture of positive and negative, it really challenges the old image of totalitarianism, the old image of Czesław Miłosz's book, Captive Minds, in which we have this, this homogeneous Orwellian vision of what communism was like. Instead, what we're seeing in reality here is ambiguity. So this brings me to the title of my talk for today, is Contextualizing. If we want to move away from the narrow perspective of the intelligentsia, the perspective of people like us. Well, a good way to begin that project is to look at various contextualizations for what happened, to broaden our lens, broaden the way we look at the communist era, and see it alongside other situations, other perspectives, other contexts, other framings. And there are a lot of ways we can do this. One way is I think, captured in this quotation from the famous Polish economist Oskar Lange from 1957, in which, in describing what the goals of the Communist Party were, he said, continuing the industrialization of Poland is not just an economic necessity, it is also a socialist prerequisite for the development of socialist democracy. Now, this points to something that we, I think, can easily slide by if we're not attentive. One of the goals of the communists, one of their primary goals, in fact, when they took power after World War II, was to guide Poland, to shepherd Poland through a process that they considered universal. And in fact, most people in the mid-20th century considered universal. The process of modernization, more specifically industrialization, which entailed a greater urbanization, cultural modernization, social modernization, that word that was so beloved in the mid-20th century. This was something that was everywhere. This is not specific to communism. They didn't see it as specific to communism. And this was this universal objective at this level was something that was very central to what they wanted to do. And you see this if you look at both their private and public writings from those early years. Now, the process of modernizing or industrializing Poland was started, obviously, long before the communists came along, started in the late 19th century. But even as we move, even in the 1930s, there was still a very, very long way to go. Yes, there was visible change and development, what we would call nowadays development, that happened in some parts of the country, and around Warsaw, around the city of Łódź, in areas of Silesia, and of course, throughout the country, the transition from serf labor to so-called free labor had happened. That had happened a generation earlier. But it was still, even at the beginning of World War II, Poland was still a very poor country, way below the European average. And it was still what we would today call an underdeveloped country. This changed during the communist era. So insofar as development was a goal of the communists, that goal they did accomplish. Just thinking about demography, the percent of the population working in the agricultural sector declined to a mere 27% by the time we get to the end of the communist era. Already in 1966, a majority of Poles lived in towns and cities. The stereotype that one often encounters of the Pole as a peasant, as someone engaged in agriculture, this is highly misleading. It is today, and it has been for many decades. Poland is a country where most of the people live in towns and cities, and only a relatively small minority is engaged in agriculture at all. Yet even as the number of farmers, peasants declined, agricultural output vastly increased. As I'll come back to later, there were a lot of problems with Polish agriculture, but the trend lines, the changes were very clearly towards growth. Industrial growth was even more dramatic. In fact, it was expanding at a stunning pace, far faster than the actual size of the industrial workforce. In other words, both total output and per worker productivity, per person productivity, were going up very fast, which is exactly what you expect to see in any industrializing, developing, modernizing country. In short, within 3 decades, Poland was transformed, profoundly transformed, from what we would call an underdeveloped country into what we would often call a developed country. Compared to the interwar years, Poland's overall productivity, at least in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, rose very dramatically after World War II. Now, the observant among you will probably notice that I have ended this chart in 1978. I'll come back to that point in a moment because there would be big changes in the 1980s that I'll talk about in a minute. So all of this is impressive. The numbers look very good, but of course, communism was about much more than just modernization. It was much more specific than that. The communists were promising a specific kind of modernization, one that would, they claimed in the mid-20th century, bring the results of modernization, higher productivity, urban lifestyles, all of that, would bring those results, but with less suffering and more widely shared benefits. One of the core arguments of Marxism, of course, is that capitalism's transition to modernity had been pretty horrific, had left vast segments of the population worse off than before. Possibly the most damning indictments of capitalism that Marxists could point to is summarized by this particular study by the economist John Komlosh, which shows what happened to basically the health and nutrition of ordinary working class English men in this case during the first century of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution made people shorter. And what does that mean? That means they were malnourished, particularly as young people growing up and needing food. Life got harder. It got much worse. It was only a century later, after a century of the process of industrialization, that we begin to see a reversal of this trend. So what Marx argued and what Marxists in the 20th century argued is that capitalism brought modernity, it brought industrialization, but the cost was enormous. And we socialists can avoid that cost. That was their promise. Well, certainly that promise resonated among Poles in the middle of the 20th century because life under capitalism in the 1920s and 30s had been really bad. It had been very, very hard. At the time of the 1931 census in Poland, 69%, more than 2/3 of all of the urban dwellings in Poland had 1 or 2 rooms. And in those rooms, an average of 4.4 people lived. Among these urban dwellings, only 16%, 16%, had running water. 13%, 13% had indoor plumbing. Only 1/3 had electricity. A full 1/3 of all of the homes in the cities of Poland had no utilities at all. In other words, they were just shantytown shacks, as one might see today if one goes to the large metropolitan areas in the developing world. And that's the cities. In fact, poverty was even worse in the countryside. The countryside at that point still constituted 60% of the population. And among the rural people, the housing crisis was acute, much worse than in the towns. An average of 5.2 people lived in every rural home. And among those rural homes, half of them were 1-room huts, 1 room. So an average of 5.2 people living in 1 room. Roughly 13% of the population owned 2/3 of the land. The inequality was striking. The remaining 87% of the population had to share the rest. The level of equality was extreme. Back in 1955, early in the communist era, the economist Włodzimierz Buchs promised, quote, "The bond between the nation and the party and the people's government will solidify, thanks to the fact that the socialist revolution is the only revolution that not only gives people freedom, but also creates the conditions for a prosperous life. Increased consumption in every aspect of life, an increase in the well-being and the culture of every working person is the foundational goal of the nation's socialist economy." Of course, you can tell that's a very propagandistic sentence. He gave that in a public speech. So it's easy to dismiss such lines as just propaganda. But they actually captured a genuine ambition that we also see in the private statements and conversations of communists from this era, that they were going to modernize Poland in a different way, in a way that they thought would be more humane and more widely shared than modernization under capitalism. And contrary to, I think, a widespread misunderstanding, they were not aesthetics who wanted to live very simply and to valorize suffering. Not at all. They actually prioritized increasing levels of consumption and increasing standards of living. And in fact, just on that level, they did accomplish quite a lot. If we look at wages very quickly after World War II returned to the pre-World War II level and then went way up from there. There were some, as you can see, some changes in the rate of growth, some of which I'll talk about in a moment. But the line of improvement was quite clear. The dismal standards of living of the 1920s and 1930s improved year after year. This is well reflected by these studies of household budgets. So the first graph shows what it was like before World War II. And this is for urban population. And you can see that before World War II, over 60% of the average household budget went to food. Whenever you see that much of a person's income going towards food, you know you're talking about a very poor population, right? This is a situation where one crisis leaves you destitute. Hunger is always just around the corner. By the time we move to the 1970s and to the 1980s, the percentage of budgets going towards food had declined dramatically. And very significantly, the other category had grown significantly. That's what we might call discretionary spending. Consumerism was growing fast. Surpassing the interwar years in terms of food consumption was actually not very hard, since it had been so poor before the war. And by already in 1949, pre-war levels had achieved again, and things went up from there. If we dig into this a little bit, we see a steady and dramatic increase in meat consumption up till the 1980s. Again, I'll return to the 1980s in a moment. This is what we typically see in societies growing wealthier in the European world, where meat consumption is quite popular, that as wealth expands, people spend more money on meat. And then there's usually a time where it gets to a certain point and then declines again as people begin more health conscious and more environmentally conscious, but that comes later. Speaking of health, another very significant thing to look at in this sort of thing is sugar consumption, or the consumption of sugar analogs. Sugar has been called by some economic historians the poor man's luxury, because it is often the very first non-essential good that we begin to see the very poor purchase, instead of, because you can't manufacture it unless you live in certain climates, begin to purchase in the market. So as societies begin to develop, looking at the very poorest, you see increases in sugar consumption as an early sign that standards of living are increasing. And sure enough, that is what we see in the Second Republic, or in the Polish People's Republic. Just as important as what increased, though, is what decreased. If we look at the consumption of carbohydrates, starches, potatoes, grains, things like that, these decline. And that's, again, very, very common. As people grow, as societies grow wealthier, diets shift with a greater emphasis on proteins and vegetables and fruits, and less reliance on grains and potatoes. And that is exactly what we see in Poland. Along with these developments, various other metrics improved as well. Infant mortality fell to pretty much the same level we would see anywhere in Europe. So that the plague of infant death was pretty much eradicated very early on. Life expectancy matched that of the US in the 1960s. Now, after that, it leveled off and the improvements slowed. I can talk about that, but still remained at relatively high levels if we compare this to the non-European, non-American world. Poland is clearly in our club by that point, and no longer with statistics that look like the developing world. In the cultural sphere, education expanded dramatically. Illiteracy more or less eliminated, as we see a distribution of educational levels that looks more or less like we would see in any European country. Now, I showed you this chart earlier, and I noted then that the second item on the chart is empty shelves. So people, when they remember the PRL, remember the empty shelves. They remember the shortages. Images like these are very familiar. They're in, if you look at any history book, you'll probably see a picture like these. They are frequently presented as examples of what life was like under communism. And the images are real. They, such scenes could be seen. They were quite real. But these pictures are also real. They are also legitimate images from the Polish People's Republic. A lot depends upon when you're taking the photograph and where you were taking the photograph. Both photographs are true, are correct. So how do we reconcile this? How do we reconcile the image of the empty shelf with the image of the full shelf? How do we reconcile all those numbers that showed rising levels of consumption with this popular memory of shortage? In order to understand the significance of the empty shelf metaphor, we need to focus for a moment on that decade that I've been skipping so far, the 1980s. The magnitude of the crisis of the 1980s cannot be overstated. It was huge and devastating. I'm happy to talk about the causes of this crisis more in the discussion if you wish. For now, just suffice it to say that this is another example of how contextualization can help. First, this was not a crisis of the Soviet bloc. Although growth was slowing in several countries, only one other country had a pattern that looked like Poland, and that was Romania. And the main cause of the crisis in Romania and in Poland were very, very similar. Both those two countries were caught in an unresolvable debt crisis. The scope of the debt crisis can be shown with this chart, the percentage of revenue from exports that's devoted to debt servicing, interest payments. In other words, to look at this, by the time we get to 1980, over 80% of all of the revenues Poland gained through export immediately left the country again as interest payments. So it's as if all the production that the country made for exports was immediately lost. None of it went back home towards the benefit of the country. This is huge. This is catastrophic. And in this regard, we find a contextualization that helps us understand what was happening in Poland. And it's a contextualization that has nothing to do with socialism. The comparison points here, almost exactly, are the countries of Latin America that also were caught in the debt crisis of that time period. All of these countries, here Mexico, Brazil, and Chile, Argentina could be put in there as well. All of these countries had levels of development, levels of wealth roughly similar to Poland's in the 1970s. All of them became heavily indebted in that decade. All of them crashed in the 1980s and crashed in ways that are very, very similar, almost parallel. It's quite striking. This much more than a comparison with other socialist countries, gives us a framing for understanding the crisis that led to the collapse of communism. And also, it's important to remember that even during the worst years of the crisis, it was never quite the case that nothing was available. The empty shelf was something that happened, but if we look at health metrics, we see that the effect was limited. So we're not talking about the sort of deprivation that is reflected in malnutrition or any other the social public health problems. If we return to our chart showing meat consumption, we get a picture of what's going on here. It's pretty dramatic. Beginning in the 1980s, the amount of meat being consumed by the average Pole fell a lot. Basically, a whole decade of progress was wiped out. That's horrible. This was really horrible. People felt that. They remember this. This was bad. Although it's important to note where it fell to. It fell to the level that Poland had in 1970. Still higher, actually, than the level in the 1950s or the 1960s. So we're not talking about a regress to levels of that would begin to show up in metrics of health outcomes. Rather, we're seeing the enormous frustration and anger that comes from going backwards when they had been going forwards. But it's still, even in the depths of the country, Poland was still showing most statistical markers that one would see in a developed country, although a poorer developed country. Okay. The debt crisis then helps us understand the image of the empty shelf, the image of the ration card, the lines. These things were real. They were, they shaped the memory of anyone who was born, let's say, in 1960 or later. Their memory is mostly of this period of hardship, this period of the 1980s, which was, as I said, very bad. And their memory then is going to have a prominent place for the line, for the shortage, for the rationing. The number of people whose memories, whose image of the Polish People's Republic dates to the 1960s or even the 1970s, these people, even by the year 2000, were a very small percentage of the population. And their recollections played a smaller role in determining the public memory of what communism was like, because communism in 1970 was very different from communism in 1985. Very different, in fact. Now, it took a long time to recover from that crash. In fact, it took longer, much longer, than the Great Depression. And in fact, the second dip of the big crisis was almost as deep as the crash of the 1930s. And this gives us a final point, and on this I'll conclude, a final point of comparison for the Polish People's Republic, the comparison to capitalism, both capitalism contemporary to the PRL and after and before. During this first stage of the crisis, that is the stage of socialist crisis, shortages, right? Often very bad shortages. The second stage of the crisis is what a crisis looks like in capitalism. No shortages. In the 1990s, the shops were full, abundant with goods, but increasing numbers of the population, percentage of the population, could not buy those goods. So they were there, you could look at them, but you could not afford them. So this is a shift. It's a dramatic shift. It's the shift from how a socialist country experiences an economic crisis to how a capitalist country experiences an economic crisis. If we look at wages, what we can see is that wages fell, and they fell a lot, and they stayed down. And it was actually only in the 21st century that wages began to return to where they had been in the 1970s. So the typical wage of the typical Pole went way down. And now you can see why so many Poles in 2000 would say it's such a mixed image. I don't have a very positive image of what capitalism was like. If we begin with the low point of the crisis, lowest point of the crisis, 1994, and then we disaggregate the top 5% from the rest of the population, what we can see is that even taking the story all the way forward to 2010, the national average, the average Pole, experienced growth, but not a whole lot in comparison to what the top 5% experienced, which was striking, which was amazing, right? Without any doubt, Poland's GDP growth, aggregate growth here, has been amazing. You can see the improvement since the depths of the crisis in the mid-90s. It's just gone up and up and up and up, and Poland's experienced one of the longest prosperous eras in the country's history. But here comes the most surprising chart I'm going to show you. I show you from this whole presentation. If we look at the rate of growth of the first 30 years of capitalism and the first 30 years of socialism, they're the same. They're virtually the same. Most Poles find it very hard to believe when I show this chart. After all, they say, my living standards today are vastly better than they were in the PRL. Of course they were, but that statement is true in almost any point over the past century. Almost at any point over the past century, you could say, you look back 30 years and say, my life is so much better than it was 30 years ago. Definitely, someone living in 1975 compared to someone who had been around 30 years earlier, no question, the improvements were stunning and dramatic. I think this is often forgotten nowadays when we say today's life is so much better than under communism. Well, of course it was, because Poland has been a developing country, which means that every generation is going to have a very different lifestyle than everyone before. And this is true regardless of the economic system. Bronisław Mink, not to be confused with his more famous brother, Hilary Mink, if those of you know Polish history, Bronisław Mink said in 1948 that socialism was going to ensure that Poland would go from being a backward country to one of the leading countries of Europe. And here we get to the final point I'll make, and the point where this comparison with capitalism we can put in that biggest of all contexts. The phrase here that matters is of Europe. Well, this they did not accomplish. They did not become, obviously, one of the wealthiest countries of Europe. This they didn't do. But it raises the question of whether that was a goal that they could ever have achieved. If Poland was to become the leading country like that, well, the first thing they were going to do is have to overtake the leading countries of the capitalist world. Well, in the 20th century, the leading countries of the capitalist world were the United States and Britain. Interestingly, up until the crisis, Poland did get closer to the level of wealth of Britain and the United States. All three countries, of course, were growing fast. Poland was growing faster. Now, of course, the crisis wiped out a lot of those gains, but even then, they still were further ahead than they had been in 1950. If we think about the continental leaders of continental Europe, well, here is where Poland did not succeed. This is where the country shows very disappointing results. Italy, West Germany, France all grew they grew faster than Poland did even before the crisis. Right? Moreover, if we compare Poland to the other peripheral countries of Europe, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, here too, the Polish results don't look as good. They kept up with Ireland until the crisis, and then they didn't anymore. But the interesting part of this is that Poland's poor performance in that regard is very much, it's very distinctive. It is not common to the entire socialist world. There's no question that in comparison with the rest of Europe, the PRL did not do very well. You can see here that they actually grew further away from the European average in the communist era and then got closer after the communist era. So that's a pretty clear-cut marker. And many Poles would look at this and say, here's a very clear and very easy evidence that socialism failed, capitalism succeeds. However, first, I would note that the Second Republic fell even further away, and that was capitalist. And more importantly, the pattern among the socialist countries shows no pattern. If you look at all of the socialist countries, before communism, after communism, and then today, there's no pattern. Some of them have, like Romania, have grown progressively closer to the European average. Others, like Ukraine, have grown progressively further away, regardless of system. Some of them grew closer under communism and then fell back under capitalism. Some of them fell back under communism and grew closer under capitalism. There's no pattern. So whatever's going on, it doesn't seem to have much to do with the specifics of capitalism or communism. Moreover, if we look on an even bigger scale, a global scale, and we take the countries that were right next to Poland in terms of wealth in the mid-20th century or before World War II. So here I just went to the charts of GDP per capita and took the countries that were right next to Poland that all had roughly the same GDP in 1938: Japan, Venezuela, South Africa, Guatemala, and Lebanon. And what you see here is that, of course, Poland didn't keep up with Japan because nobody in the world kept up with Japan. Japan is the only underdeveloped country that became truly wealthy in the second half of the 20th century. Venezuela went faster, but that was because of oil. And of course, they also hit the debt crisis, in fact, even greater than Poland did. Otherwise, Poland is more or less performing at a level that is very similar to global countries that were similar to Poland before communism. Perhaps the best context and the final context for analyzing the PRL is the broadest one of all in both space and time. If we take the really long view and position Poland against the entire world, we see that Poland has grown closer has increased the gap above the global average. They were, and have been, and will be above the global average. And through the entire communist era, up until the crisis, they were increasing that. They were growing faster than the rest of the world. Looking at this same stat in a different way, if we look at the global average, what we see is basically 2 centuries of Poland becoming closer to the global average and then passing the global average and then passing it by quite a lot, currently double the global average. But the thing is, this growth, we see this growth, this narrowing of the gap or expanding of the gap, I guess. We see it in partitionaires, we see it in the PRL, we see it in the Third Republic. We don't see it in the Second Republic. Obviously, World War II was a catastrophe. So in this big picture, we've seen socialist successes and socialist crises. We've seen capitalist successes and capitalist crises. History, unfortunately, in this regard, doesn't give us any clear data. It turns us back to where I started this lecture, and that is ambiguity. And that's why the task for us as historians has to be to recover the nuance and extrapolate away from excessively broad judgments. Okay, now I look forward to your questions.